Welcome to the Content Amplified podcast, brought to you by Masset. Our goal is to help you get more from your marketing content. Each episode is a 10 to 15 minute interview with industry experts that share amazing insights to help you squeeze as much juice from your content as you possibly can. Here's today's interview.
Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by Kevin. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ben. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for tuning in.
You bet. Absolutely. Well, Kevin, before we dive into the subject, I'd love to just learn a little bit more about you and share your background, what you love about marketing.
Yeah, sure. So it's hard to know exactly where to start, but I guess one interesting place, because I do like marketing origin stories, and I feel like most people don't fall into marketing with that as an intention growing up. So the way I got into it is kind of interesting, I guess. I'm a Southern California native and grew up surfing and ended up getting a job in my teens as a retail worker at a surf shop. And then also at the same time, this was like, to date myself, around the time period of like Napster and some of the initial .com kind of boom. And just with my stepbrother and myself, we got really into like building websites. And so I ended up building this website for the surf shop that I was working at, and classic, like, build it and no one came. And I was like, oh, I need to do some things like SEO and partnerships and stuff like that to drive people to the website. And that's kind of how I got into marketing, or at least digital marketing. And then, was there for quite a while. And then in 2010-ish, I decided like, oh, it's time to up level this e-commerce thing and go to Silicon Valley, San Francisco area, and came up here and started working at a software company. It's called Giga. It was acquired by SAP, but they're just like, hey, we bought this thing called Marketo, like, figure out how it works. And that's kind of how I got into like marketing operations and understanding how SaaS works and all this kind of stuff. And along the way, I made some like lucky decisions and joined a company called Segments as a growth marketer there, and learned a ton and had a like pretty good run there. And then parlayed that into marketing lead at a company called Retool, who's also doing well right now, and a pretty established company. And then, now I'm working as head of marketing at a company called Common Room, which we can get into later if it makes sense. But yeah, that's kind of my journey in a pretty short, like 2 minute or so time span. So
I love it. That's awesome. Well, one of the main subjects for today that I'm really curious about is social content. So we had kind of looked at this a little bit and wanted to have this discussion. Social content's all over the place. I think a lot of people, especially in B2B, are really trying to figure it out. How do we approach social? We might not have a great following. Do we just promote like new products and features, things like that? Or how do we take advantage of this channel? What are your initial thoughts? Like what should a business consider when looking at creating social content?
It's a question that I don't know the answer to myself. I'm still the exploratory kind of like trying to figure things out, and it's definitely changing a lot. But when I kind of think about content in general, is going a little bit back to first principles. Aside from like, what's the medium, what's the tactic, what's the channel? Taking a step back and being like, okay, our objective here is to reach X audience that we've defined, by a certain number of criteria, whether it's like role or for graphics or, something else. And to reach that audience, we want to reach them with a message that's going to be either helpful or insightful or, fix a pain point. And so really thinking through like, okay, here's our audience. Here's the message that we want to send to them because it's going to help them out. And then if you can get those two things right, that is like 80 to maybe 99% of how to do content marketing right, whether that is finding that match on a social channel or a blog or via text messages or whatever. Like, I think the medium and the tactics don't matter so much as the fundamentals of finding the right audience and creating content that speaks to that audience. I will caveat in saying, like, if you try and distribute that content, distribution is like another thing, is a very big factor. But if you try and distribute that content to a place where your audience isn't at, like, that's also part of the equation. And so part of that with social is like, okay, is my audience the audience that we're targeting on social, and can we like get our content in front of them on social? So that's kind of like usually the driving force of like, is this the right channel to invest in? And for a lot of people, it is like, there's so many people on social platforms. So, oftentimes, whether it's LinkedIn or TikTok or YouTube, your audience is probably on one of those channels, right?
I love it. So going a little more tactical. So I'm on social media. I know my audience. I'm trying to drive value. Like, what's the objective? Am I trying to like send blog traffic all the time? Am I sending them to feature pages? Am I going after the coveted like button? What are some things that you think about when it comes to almost the call to action when it's on social media, like the objective, where the conversation takes place? What do you think about on that level?
Yeah, I don't think that there is a prescriptive objective that we can blanket across everything, right? It's kind of like you're really thinking about what your objective is for the audience you're reaching. I can provide some more concrete examples. So at the company I work for, Common Room, our objectives aren't always for someone to read a piece of content, come to our website, and sign up for a demo request or sign up for the product. Like, that's a pretty like unrealistic objective unless you have an audience that you're reaching that's like very far down the funnel. So as we map out like the audiences that we reach, the audiences that we want to reach, I should say, and where they are in that funnel kind of dictates what our objective is. So for 80+% of we're a new-ish company and are disrupting a market. And so like there's not a lot of people that are even aware of us or a solution like Common Room exists. So a lot of the content that we create and the objective around that content is around education, sharing our point of view, sharing something that is insightful or not even insightful, just more like curiosity inducing. Like, like some of the objective is like, I want someone to read this content and be like, I never thought about things that way. That's an interesting take. And like that's the kind of stuff that gets sticky and like it's associated with your brand. So I would say for a lot of our content, the objective is just to reach the right audience and for that audience to learn something new, have another takeaway, and associate that with our brand. And then there's things down the line is like as they engage more or as we can like retarget them or something like that, we can kind of like point them to like, oh, here's an actual like playbook or something that you can use, and that drives someone to a blog post or to some sort of like interactive demo or something, and then they take like the next step. So it's kind of like mapping out, where are you meeting people where they are, and like the objective of your content should be aligned with where people are in their customer journey.
I love that. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned the term point of view, and as I've been looking at social media content and a lot of creators, it tends to be that businesses that have a strong point of view trying to convince the market that a certain thing done a certain way is the right way, or debunking old myths or whatever, it tends to increase engagement. How do you, as a business, as an influencer on LinkedIn, how do you view having a point of view and the importance of really kind of taking a stand on something and trying to push forward an idea or a concept to your audience?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is I don't like having a hot take for the sake of having a hot take. Although I probably am guilty of being a little bit hyperbolic about some of the things that I posted. But the reason for doing that or putting a stance somewhere is that if you're trying to be something for everyone, you're kind of nothing for nobody. I don't know if that's the right way of phrasing that, but I think people get the point. It's just like if you need to take a stance, and like the idea around taking a stance is to be purposefully polarizing. And so when you take a stance, I tend to see people who like really align with that point of thinking, or you change their mind, they become your fans or your champions and really like are advocates for the cause. And then the other group is maybe is a counterpoint to it, but it's like I'd rather have that. I'd rather have 1,000 fans than 10,000 that are following but don't care about anything at all. So I think that's kind of the idea behind taking a stance and putting a flag in the ground and being a little bit opinionated. It's just like if you don't do that, then you're not really differentiating yourself, and your content gets zero distribution, zero awareness, and like no one can really kind of rally around the cause.
I think that's really cool. Yeah, absolutely. It's almost as important to dissuade people from being a part of that audience as it is to gather the people. It's gathering the right kinds of people. So I love that perspective there. So when you're, let's say you're working with a business and they're not doing it on social media. They just don't quite get it. What would your recommendation be to just start? Like how should someone approach it? What should their expectations be? Looking at it, I think all too often when we try something, we expect immediate results or a dollar to dollar ROI, things of that nature. How should businesses even look at social media in general and justify the time and effort into the channel? And how do they get started?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the last question too, around like having a point of view or having a stance. But a lot of times where I see companies get into trouble is where they're like, they see someone else doing social and they think that, mimicking or going through the motions is going to get them where they need to go versus kind of taking a step back and thinking like, what is our actual strategy and approach here? It's just kind of going back to like, doing tactical things versus like really understanding what your strategy is. When I think of a content strategy or even just like a marketing strategy, it goes back to that kind of concept I was talking about earlier, which is like, okay, who is our audience? I like to think of it like a Venn diagram, like who's our audience? And then like, what is the message that we're going to convey to that audience? And like the bigger the overlap between those two circles of a Venn diagram, like the content in the middle of that is going to like reach the right audience and like going to lead to results. And so if people are going through the motions, like kind of reset around that. And is like, are you understanding what your real objective is? And like, are you doing the things that are going to like get to the outcomes that you're looking to do? Or are you just kind of like mimicking someone else and expecting the same results? Because like that is a recipe for non-results. Yeah, I try to like get back to some sort of like example there of what I've seen work. And one thing that works really well, that's working well for us at Common Room, is to kind of like find people who are aligned with that message and that line in the sand, and the people who have a bigger distribution and bigger reach than we do. And so like that is a good way to like pilot something if you're trying to like kickstart something off the ground, because I feel like people have a lot of trouble going from like 0 to 1. And one way to like validate, is this social thing going to work for me, or is this content thing going to work for me, is to find people who are creators and are talking about that space and partner with them to see like, oh, if they talk about things in this certain way, is it going to drive the results? And then that kind of like informs your learning and your brand strategy over time, versus like, starting from, where this brand no one knows about us. And then like you run a 3-month pilot and you get a little bit of traction here or there, but it's hard to get a lot of signal. And I feel like that is the kind of time where people are like, oh, 3 months didn't work, I'm going to give up on this whole channel, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And then, but it's really like a long-term game that they're seeing success of other companies, but those companies have been putting like the time in for, 5 years or something like that. So setting expectations and aligning on that is one helpful mechanism, but then also kind of working with people who have that distribution is a good way to validate something up front.
I love that. So as you're finding and working with these partners and groups that have similar audiences, they've already kind of built up the following and have the influence, how do you find the right partners? And then what does the agreement look like? So how do you incentivize them? How are you mutually benefited from that? How is it not just here's another sponsored post kind of an idea? How do you really work on strategy with these partners?
Oh man, I will tell you, it is not easy. It is a laborious thing that is very niche right now, which is kind of like where, if you think about where there's areas of leverage, it's usually when there's like these emerging things, and it's very much in the emerging stage right now. It's not like a developed kind of platform where you can say like, okay, Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever, like I'm going to put dollars in and get like distribution to the right audience. It's like definitely not anything like that with working with creators. So it's certainly a challenge. It's even just a challenge, like you mentioned, kind of like even finding the right people. But I guess one tip to mention there is like, before engaging in like just finding some list on the internet or something of like, here are the top influencers in my category, join the conversation, or like or be a lurker in the conversation and a bystander, and like see where different topics and different people are getting traction, and do that for a few weeks beforehand. And then that'll give you a kind of a better point of view around like, oh, this person here, like I really like their topics, and I can see how my brand or my point of view can like fit into that. And then really like, it's doing things that don't scale to make it happen. It's just like, oh, these people, you can reach out to them. Some of them are more developed than others and have like a pricing sheet or a media kit, or some of them are just like, yeah, just send me like a couple $100 via PayPal. Like I'm good. And so it's certainly like a little bit of the Wild West right now, but I think the important part is learning and like listening and understanding the space, and then just getting started with like a crawl, walk, run approach, and just like reaching out to a few people and seeing if you can get a partnership going. So that's how we've been doing it. I did it back at when I was at Retool. This is kind of like where we started. It was more on YouTube than it was on LinkedIn, and now at Common Room, we're using LinkedIn creators or influencers or whatever you want to call them, and then also at the same time, kind of building up our own internal advocacy and influence from the inside, but using others as a distribution mechanism in the interim.
Yeah, I think the LinkedIn creators and influencers side of things very much is the wild, wild west, where a lot of these people know that they need to build some kind of a presence on LinkedIn, but they have no idea what they're doing with it. And people are not used to sponsored content, and it's an interesting platform to really set out in. So I'm excited to see what the future of LinkedIn holds.
Yeah, I will say like a few tips to follow on that I didn't quite hit on already is that the partnership and the authenticity behind the partnership really matters. And if the person who you're partnering with doesn't believe in the products or the story, then I would absolutely not partner with that person. Usually the creators themselves are pretty good about that. They're like, I'm not going to endorse anything that like I don't agree with. And then the other thing that I've seen a lot of companies do, or feedback from a lot of creators, is that like, I know my audience better than you do. So like, let me dictate or let me come up with the copy and the strategy and the approach, rather than corporate tops down, kind of like telling them what to say. And I think that's where authenticity happens too in the wild, is like, you really can tell the difference between like, okay, we're sponsoring this and like, this is the copy that we told you to read verbatim, versus like them coming up with their own copy. And I would say definitely the creators know their stuff and they know their audience, and like let them kind of run with it. And if it's not aligned with your brand, then just don't work with that person versus trying to force it, you know?
I love that. Well, as promised, these episodes are 15 minutes of tactical advice, and we've already gone over.
Oh, wow.
It goes so quick. It's so fast. Kevin, thank you so much for your insights. If anyone wants to connect with you online, how do they find you?
Follow me on LinkedIn is probably the best way, or kevin@commonroom.io is my email. And check out Common Room. We have a free version. I didn't get into that, but it's all good. Yeah, that's where you can reach me.
Well, tell us a little bit more about Common Room real quick before we end. I'd love to hear more about it.
Sure. Yeah. Real quick. We are in this hot space with many creators where we're talking about different signals across all these different digital breadcrumbs, product data, LinkedIn data, community data, website activity data. And what we do is we aggregate all that into one place and then add a identity layer on top of it, so you can extract signal from the noise across all those channels and reach the people who are in your ideal customer profile and turn those people into advocates and customers. So at a really, really high level, that's what we do. And if you're interested in, taking signals and turning them into customers, like that's, hit me up or check out Common Room.
I love that. That's fascinating. I'm going to have to look into that. That's super cool. Kevin, again, thanks for the time. This was super helpful. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks, Ben. Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Content Amplified podcast. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And for additional ways to get more out of your content, visit our website at getmasset.com. That's getmasset.com. And tune in next time to the Content Amplified podcast.